My sister's boyfriend spent Thanksgiving mocking our family. Can you imagine someone coming to your family Thanksgiving, insulting everything you hold dear, making you feel culturally inferior, only for them to be exposed as the biggest fraud you've ever met? And what if that fraud was your own sister's boyfriend, and revealing the truth shattered her entire world? It all started at Thanksgiving. My sister Amy brought her new boyfriend, Lorenzo, and from the moment he walked in, he was insufferable. The entire meal was just him explaining why our food was inferior to Italian cuisine. He picked up the beautiful turkey, carved with love, and declared, in Italy, they'd never serve such dry meat. Italians, they understand moisture, flavor. My blood was boiling. He then looked at our mashed potatoes and actually laughed, saying his nana would cry if she saw us eating processed potatoes instead of handmade gnocchi. But the absolute last straw? He took my grandmother's pumpkin pie, a pie she'd won county fair ribbons for, and said, Americans don't understand dessert because you haven't grown up with proper Italian dolce. He kept repeating this infuriating line, you can't help being culturally inferior because you weren't blessed to be born Italian. The worst part? Amy sat there, beaming, like he was reciting poetry instead of systematically dismantling her entire family. Lorenzo refused to eat anything but bread, and even that wasn't good enough. It's not real bread, he sniffed. Real bread only comes from Italian bakeries, ancient techniques, passed down through generations. He droned on about his family's villa in Tuscany that had been theirs for centuries, claiming we'd never understand the connection to land and tradition that Italians had. He even claimed his bloodline traced back to Roman senators and that Mediterranean genetics were scientifically superior for intelligence and creativity. My dad, bless his calm heart, asked what he did for work. Lorenzo replied he was between opportunities because American companies didn't appreciate the Italian approach to business, which was about relationships and style, not vulgar profit-seeking. Amy, of course, jumped in to defend him, saying Lorenzo was just too sophisticated for regular jobs. The rest of dinner was torture. He lectured us, teaching Italian words, then claiming we were pronouncing them wrong. My cousin Maria, who speaks fluent Italian from her semester in Rome, tried to gently correct him, but he just scoffed. You learned tourist Italian, not the pure dialect my family speaks. He boasted about family vineyards whose wine was served to the Pope, saying Americans wouldn't understand because we drank beer like barbarians. His mother was personal friends with Armani. His uncle invented a type of pasta served in Michelin star restaurants. Every story got more outlandish. Every comparison made us sound more pathetic for not being Italian. The next week, Lorenzo had the audacity to invite us to his apartment for an authentic Italian feast to show us what real food tasted like. Amy practically begged us to go, to support his cooking. We arrived to find him serving spaghetti with Jared sauce, which he doctored with dried herbs. He served it on paper plates, calling it rustic Italian style. The grissini from his family's bakery were clearly grocery store breadsticks. The salad? Iceberg lettuce with bottled dressing, which he declared his Nana's secret recipe. We all pretended it was amazing while Lorenzo lectured us about finally experiencing true Italian culture. That's when I snapped. I just knew something was off. My spidey senses were screaming. I decided to do some research. And what I found? Oh, it was wild. Lorenzo's last name wasn't even remotely Italian. It was Anderson. He'd changed it on social media. His parents lived in Ohio and ran a hardware store. The villa in Tuscany? A vacation rental they'd stayed at once for 3 days. And his Nana? Very much alive, living in Cleveland, not making pasta in some Italian mountain village. I found her on social media, a lovely woman posting recipes for Midwest casseroles and pictures from her church potluck. I reached out to her, saying I was Amy's sister and wanted to learn more about Lorenzo's family traditions. She was thrilled, immediately launching into how Lorenzo had always been creative with stories since childhood. She said he'd been obsessed with The Sopranos in high school and started pretending to be Italian, even though they were Scottish and German. She was worried about his lying, but thought it was harmless. Harmless? Oh, I had a plan. I invited Nana Anderson to Sunday dinner without telling Lorenzo. When she walked in, Lorenzo went white. Seriously, all the color drained from his face. She hugged him and in her thick Ohio accent, said how nice it was to meet Amy's family. Amy, utterly oblivious, asked if this was the Nana from Italy. Lorenzo's grandmother just laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh. Oh, honey, I've never been to Italy in my life, but I'd love to go someday. She'd brought her famous green bean casserole and started telling stories about Lorenzo growing up in suburban Columbus. Little League, chess club. She showed us pictures of teenage Lorenzo at Comic-Con dressed as Mario, saying he'd always loved Italian characters. He'd even had his own cooking show as a kid, making up stories about traveling to France to learn from master chefs, even though he'd never left Ohio. Amy sat completely still, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. The rest of us tried to look anywhere else, at our plates, the ceiling, out the window, but it was impossible not to watch this whole thing unravel. Lorenzo kept interrupting his grandmother, his voice getting higher and faster. He tried to explain she was confused, that she was talking about when he was a child and didn't understand the nuances of regional Italian dialects. He claimed his family spoke a rare Tuscan variation that most Italians wouldn't even recognize, which was why it seemed different from what she remembered. Sweat started showing on his forehead, even though the dining room wasn't warm. His grandmother, bless her heart, just smiled and kept swiping through her phone, completely missing how desperate he was getting. She found his high school graduation photo and turned the screen toward us. There was Lorenzo, in a blue cap and gown on a normal suburban lawn with a basketball hoop in the driveway. The house was plain beige siding, black shutters, the kind you see in every middle American neighborhood. She zoomed in on his face. Oh, wasn't he handsome that day? We were so proud. She talked about him getting into State University, how his parents drove him up, helping him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs in the August heat. She laughed about his dad making 4 trips because Lorenzo insisted on bringing his entire collection of cooking magazines. Amy's face had gone from confused to completely pale. I could almost see her doing the mental math, comparing every story Lorenzo had told her against what his sweet grandmother was so casually revealing. Lorenzo stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. "Grandma, you're confused," he gasped. "You're mixing me up with a cousin who looks similar." His voice cracked on the word cousin, and his hands were shaking. His grandmother looked up at him with genuine surprise. "Honey, I only have one grandson. Just you. I'd never forget a single detail about your life." She pulled up another photo, without even pausing. This one showed Lorenzo's parents standing in front of a store with a huge banner, Anderson Family Hardware, established 1987. His mom and dad were cutting a ribbon with oversized scissors, both grinning, rows of tools and paint cans visible through the windows. This was the grand reopening, after they renovated 5 years ago, she chirped. Lorenzo was there all day, helping stock shelves. Lorenzo tried to grab the phone, but she pulled it back, looking hurt and utterly bewildered by his reaction. Amy pushed back from the table. "I need to use the bathroom," she said, her voice flat and strange, like she was trying very hard to sound normal. She walked out without looking at anyone. Then we heard the lock click. For a few seconds, we just sat there in this horrible, thick silence. Lorenzo frozen by his chair, his grandmother looking between all of us like she'd missed something crucial. Then I heard it, a muffled sound through the bathroom door. Clearly crying. I got up, followed, knocked quietly, and said it was just me. Amy unlocked the door, and I slipped inside. She was sitting on the floor, back against the bathtub, mascara streaking dark trails down her face. She looked up at me. How could I have been so stupid? Her voice broke on every other word. I sat down next to her. Didn't say anything at first. What could I say that wouldn't sound like I told you so? She pulled her knees to her chest and started talking, reliving the past 6 months. How she'd defended Lorenzo to her friends when they called him pretentious. How she'd bragged about dating someone with such an exotic background, from a villa with centuries of family traditions. She told her roommate about his connection to Italian nobility, his family's wine served to the Pope. Posted photos with captions about her sophisticated European boyfriend, who understood art and culture in ways Americans couldn't. Every single thing she'd said about him to other people, every boast, was based on a complete lie. Now she had to face the fact that she'd been incredibly naive, or willfully blind. The worst part, she said, was remembering all the times something felt off. When he couldn't answer basic questions about Italy. When his Italian pronunciation sounded wrong, even to her untrained ear. She'd just made excuses for him in her head because she wanted the fantasy to be real. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes while she cried and talked, and I just listened. That's what she needed. Eventually, she wiped her face with toilet paper. "We should go back out there," she said, a new resolve in her voice. "Hiding in the bathroom isn't going to change anything." We walked back to the dining room to find Lorenzo and his grandmother on opposite sides of the table, like a tense standoff. He was trying to explain that he'd been embracing his spiritual heritage, that he felt Italian in his soul, even if his bloodline was technically Scottish and German. His grandmother's face held a mix of hurt and disappointment that made her look 10 years older. "Why wasn't our family good enough for you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you have to pretend to be someone else entirely?" Dad cleared his throat. "Lorenzo," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of calm that means he was actually seething. "Why did you change your name and invent an entire false identity?" Lorenzo's whole body seemed to collapse inward. He sank back into his chair, head in his hands. When he started talking, his voice was so quiet we had to lean in. He said he'd always felt boring and ordinary growing up in Ohio. Just another average kid in an average town with nothing special about him. When he got to college, he started telling people he was Italian. Suddenly, they found him interesting. They wanted to hear his stories, treated him like he was cultured and sophisticated instead of just a hardware store owner's son. He said it started small, just claiming his family was Italian. But then people asked questions, and he had to make up answers. Each lie required another lie to support it, until he'd built this entire fake history. He looked at Amy. "I knew it was wrong," he whispered. "But by the time I met you, I was in too deep. I thought if I told the truth, you'd never want to be with boring, regular me." His grandmother's face showed disappointment mixed with real concern, like she was seeing for the first time how deep her grandson's problems went. Amy stood there for a long moment, just staring at Lorenzo. I could see her working through everything in her head. Then, she told him to leave. Her voice was shaking, but it was firm. Lorenzo started apologizing, saying he did it because he loved her, wanted to be worthy of her, that he'd planned to tell her the truth eventually. Amy cut him off. "Lying for 6 months isn't love, Lorenzo. It's manipulation. And I can't trust anything about you anymore. I don't even know who you really are because every single thing you told me about yourself was fake." Lorenzo tried to argue, but his grandmother put a hand on his arm. "Let's go, son," she said gently. "You've done enough damage." They left through the front door, his grandmother giving us an apologetic look over her shoulder. We heard Lorenzo's car start up and drive away. Our family sat in uncomfortable silence for what felt like forever. Nobody knew what to say or where to look. The tension was so thick, it felt hard to breathe. Then Mom started laughing. Just a quiet chuckle at first, then it grew louder. "I can't believe he served us jarred sauce and called it his Nana's recipe," she giggled, "when his actual Nana makes green bean casserole." Dad joined in, saying the part about his family inventing pasta shapes was particularly bold. The tension broke like a popped balloon. Suddenly, we were all sharing the most ridiculous things Lorenzo had claimed. My uncle brought up the Armani connection. My aunt mentioned the Pope's wine. Cousin Maria was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes, remembering how he'd corrected her Italian when he clearly didn't speak a word of it. Amy sat quiet through all of this. Not laughing, but not crying either. Just processing. Over the next few days, Amy stayed at my apartment. She couldn't face going back to her own place, where she'd spent so much time with Lorenzo. She went through their text messages, reading months of conversations with new eyes. She found photos he'd claimed were from his family's villa. A reverse image search showed they were stock photos from a vacation rental website. Stories about family traditions that made no sense now. Like the time he celebrated a specific saint's feast day that she now realized he'd just made up. Every message, every photo, became evidence of how thoroughly he deceived her. And each discovery seemed to hurt her all over again. She showed me a text where he described his Nana's pasta recipe in detail, claiming it had been passed down for generations. We just stared at it, knowing his real grandmother probably had the recipe written on an index card in a kitchen drawer in Cleveland. Amy deleted his number, blocked him on social media. "I need a clean break from this whole mess," she said. A couple of days later, Amy's roommate, Cecilia, stopped by my apartment. She stood in the doorway holding 2 coffees. "Can I come in?" she asked, "to talk about Lorenzo." I let her in, and she sat on my couch, hands wrapped around the coffee cup like she needed something to anchor her. She said she'd been suspicious of him for months, but didn't want to upset Amy, who seemed so happy. Cecilia described how Lorenzo would contradict himself constantly about basic Italian facts, claiming his family was from Sicily one week, Tuscany the next. He mispronounced common Italian words that even she knew from high school Spanish, words similar enough that his mistakes were obvious. Cecilia told me about the time Lorenzo claimed his family made their own olive oil, then later said they imported it from a specific region, then changed the story again to say they sold it at their restaurant. She'd actually kept track of these inconsistencies in her phone notes because something just felt wrong, but she couldn't prove anything concrete. She showed me the notes, dozens of contradictions, from the number of cousins he claimed to have to whether his Nana lived in a village or a city. Cecilia said she tried to hint to Amy that Lorenzo's stories didn't add up, but Amy would get defensive, accuse her of being jealous. She felt terrible now for not pushing harder or doing her own research like I had. I told her Amy needed to figure it out herself, and that sometimes people have to learn these lessons the hard way, even when it hurts to watch. Amy called me later that week. She wanted to apologize to Nana Anderson for the awkward dinner. She felt embarrassed that Lorenzo's grandmother had witnessed the whole confrontation and probably thought our family was crazy. I gave her the number, and Amy disappeared into her room for over an hour. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she seemed calmer than she'd been in days. She said Nana Anderson had been incredibly kind and understanding. Lorenzo's grandmother explained that Lorenzo had always been obsessed with being special and different, even as a little kid. She told Amy about how he'd go through phases where he'd claim to be related to famous people or pretend he had talents he didn't actually possess. Nana Anderson thought he'd outgrown it after high school, but clearly, the lying had gotten worse. She said Lorenzo's parents had tried to get him help when he was younger, but he'd refused to admit there was a problem. Amy asked if his grandmother knew why he'd chosen to pretend to be Italian specifically. Nana Anderson said he'd always romanticized Italy after watching mob movies as a teenager. He'd convinced himself that being Italian would make him more interesting and confident. Eventually, the lie became his whole identity. Then, Nana Anderson told Amy something that made everything even sadder. Lorenzo's parents didn't even know about the fake Italian identity because he barely talked to them anymore. He'd distanced himself from his family over the past few years, too busy maintaining his fake persona to deal with people who knew the truth. His parents thought he was just busy with work and his social life, not realizing their son had created an entirely different person. Nana Anderson said Lorenzo's mom and dad were worried, but didn't know how to reach him when he kept them at arm's length. She asked Amy if she'd be willing to talk to them, because they were concerned about their son's mental health and his disconnect from reality. Amy agreed immediately, saying she wanted to understand what had happened and maybe help if she could. Nana Anderson gave her their phone number and said they'd be grateful to hear from someone who'd seen what Lorenzo had become. I watched Amy go through all of this, and I felt weird about my own role in exposing Lorenzo. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd been right about him being a fraud, and I'd saved my sister from wasting more time on a liar. But another part felt guilty, seeing how much pain Amy was in, crying at night and questioning every moment of their relationship. I kept wondering if there had been a gentler way to reveal the truth, or if the dramatic confrontation at dinner had been too harsh. "Ruben, A family friend who'd helped me dig up information about Lorenzo stopped by to check on Amy. He found me sitting on the back porch staring at nothing and asked if I was okay. I told him I felt like I'd done the right thing, but in the worst possible way. Ruben sat down next to me. Amy needed to know the truth, he said, even if the method was harsh. Staying in a relationship built on lies would have hurt her worse eventually. Maybe after she'd invested years instead of months. He said, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is show them an ugly truth before they get in too deep. I asked him if he thought I'd been cruel. He shook his head. You were protective, he insisted. Lorenzo insulted your entire family at Thanksgiving and continued lying to Amy's face every single day. That wasn't your fault. Amy met with Lorenzo's parents at a coffee shop downtown the following week. She came back to my apartment afterward and told me they were genuinely kind people who seemed as confused by their son's behavior as we were. They apologized repeatedly for Lorenzo's treatment of our family and the lies he'd told Amy. His dad explained they'd tried to get Lorenzo into therapy for years because of his lying habit, but he was an adult and they couldn't force him to get help. His mom said they'd noticed him pulling away from the family and creating these elaborate stories, but they didn't realize how far it had gone until Nana Anderson called them after our dinner. They showed Amy pictures of Lorenzo as a kid, a normal suburban boy playing in the yard and going to school events. Nothing like the sophisticated Italian he pretended to be. His parents said they'd tried to talk to him about his lying multiple times, but he'd get angry and defensive, insisting he wasn't lying but embracing his heritage. They'd eventually stopped confronting him because it only pushed him further away. Amy told them she appreciated their honesty and that she hoped Lorenzo would get the help he needed. His mom hugged her and said she was sorry Amy had gotten caught up in their son's problems. 2 weeks after the dinner confrontation, Amy got a long email from Lorenzo. She showed it to me. It was a heartfelt apology, an admission that he needed professional help. He wrote that creating the Italian persona had made him feel confident and interesting for the first time in his life. He'd always felt boring and ordinary, and pretending to be from this exotic background gave him an identity that made people pay attention to him. He admitted he knew it was wrong, but he'd gotten so deep into the lie that he didn't know how to stop without losing everything he'd built. Lorenzo said his parents had found him a therapist, and he'd started going to sessions twice a week. He understood if Amy never wanted to speak to him again, but he wanted her to know he was genuinely sorry for the pain he'd caused. He said the lies had started small in college and snowballed until he couldn't tell what was real anymore. He thanked her for the time they'd spent together, even though it was based on deception, and said he'd always remember her kindness. Amy spent a whole day thinking about how to respond. She wrote and deleted several drafts before finally settling on something short and clear. She told him she appreciated the apology and was glad he was getting professional help, but she needed space and they couldn't be together. She hoped therapy would help him figure out why he felt the need to create a fake identity and that he'd find peace with who he really was. Amy said she needed to move forward without him in her life and that she hoped he'd respect that boundary. She told me later that it felt good to set that boundary clearly instead of leaving things open or giving him false hope. She said writing the email helped her close that chapter and start thinking about what came next. She admitted she still felt stupid for believing everything Lorenzo told her, but she was trying to be gentle with herself about it. At our next family dinner a few weeks later, Amy surprised everyone by bringing Nana Anderson as a guest. His grandmother had become an unexpected friend to Amy during their phone conversations, bonding over the whole strange situation. Nana Anderson brought her famous green bean casserole again, and this time, everyone actually enjoyed it without the tension of exposing Lorenzo's lies. She shared real family recipes and stories about growing up in Cleveland, talking about her parents who'd immigrated from Scotland, the neighborhood where she'd raised her kids. She told us about meeting her husband at a church social and how they'd built the hardware store from nothing. The stories were simple and honest, nothing dramatic or exotic, but they felt genuine in a way Lorenzo's fake Italian tales never had. Amy sat next to her, laughing at stories about young Lorenzo getting into normal kid trouble. The real connection between them felt so much better than any of Lorenzo's manufactured drama. Nana Anderson said she was grateful Amy had reached out because it helped her understand what her grandson had become. She told us she was hopeful the therapy would help him find his way back to himself. My cousin Maria, who Lorenzo had dismissed for speaking tourist Italian, pulled Amy aside after dinner. They sat on the front steps, talking for a long time while the rest of us cleaned up. Maria told Amy she'd been so angry watching Lorenzo insult her language skills when he clearly knew nothing about Italian. She'd wanted to call him out at Thanksgiving, but didn't want to cause a scene or embarrass Amy. Maria admitted she'd looked up some of the phrases Lorenzo used, and they were either completely wrong or didn't exist at all in any Italian dialect. Amy apologized for not standing up for Maria when Lorenzo was being disrespectful, saying she'd been so caught up in defending him that she'd ignored how rude he was being to her own family. Maria hugged her and said she understood that sometimes when you're in a relationship, you can't see things clearly. They talked about the signs Amy had missed, the red flags she'd ignored because she wanted so badly to believe Lorenzo was this amazing person. Maria said the experience taught them both something important about trusting their instincts when something feels off. A few months passed, and Amy started dating again, though she approached it completely differently than before. I noticed she asked way more questions now, paid attention to small inconsistencies. She'd fact-check stories casually, not obsessively, but just staying aware of whether things added up. Amy told me the Lorenzo experience had taught her that if someone seemed too good to be true, or constantly needed to prove how special they were, it was worth investigating before getting emotionally invested. She'd learned to value authenticity over excitement. She realized someone's real story was more interesting than any fake persona they could create. She went on dates with normal guys who had regular jobs and honest backgrounds. And she seemed happier, even though the relationships were less dramatic. Amy finally understood that real connection came from being genuine with each other, not from one person performing an elaborate character for the other. Nana Anderson started showing up at our Sunday dinners every other week. Honestly, she fit in better than Lorenzo ever had. She brought casseroles with names like Church Potluck Surprise and Midwest Medley that tasted way better than anything Lorenzo had pretended to make from scratch. She told stories about working at the hardware store, teaching Lorenzo to ride a bike in their driveway. Normal, everyday family stuff that felt real instead of made up. One Sunday, she mentioned that Lorenzo had started therapy and was talking to his parents again after months of barely calling them. She said the therapist was helping him figure out why he needed to invent a whole fake life instead of just being himself. Nana Anderson looked sad when she talked about it, like she blamed herself for not noticing how bad the lying had gotten. Amy told her it wasn't her fault, that Lorenzo was an adult who made his own choices about pretending to be someone else. Dinners with Nana Anderson became something we all looked forward to because she was genuinely funny and warm, without trying to prove anything. 6 months after the big confrontation, Amy was doing better than I'd seen her in years. She started dating a guy who worked in accounting, drove a normal car, and didn't have any secret identities or fake backstories. She told me she'd learned to pay attention when something felt off, instead of ignoring it because she wanted the relationship to work. Amy actually thanked me one night for exposing Lorenzo, even though the dinner had been brutal and embarrassing. She said she'd rather deal with one painful truth than spend years believing comfortable lies that would eventually fall apart anyway. Our whole family got closer after everything happened, like we'd all survived something weird together and came out stronger. We still joke about Lorenzo's Jared sauce and his fake Italian accent, but mostly, we're just glad Amy got out before things got even worse. This whole experience really got me thinking about truth, lies, and how much we sometimes want to believe the fantasy. What about you? Have you ever had to expose a painful truth or been in Amy's shoes, realizing you'd been lied to? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.